Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Today we look back to look forward. As the author of a new book, John Ibbitson, said, to understand our times today, we have to understand theirs. And by theirs, he means John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson. The book is called The Duel, Diefenbaker, Pearson, and the Making of Modern Canada. And it really, truly is that. These two men represent the vision and also the compromises and the political fights that actually shaped who we are today. John Ibbitson, a longtime journalist and writer with the Globe and Mail, writer at large, author of many books, The Big Shift, about the change in Canadian politics, and The Empty Planet, about, in a sense, the depopulation of our world. But John, welcome. Great to see you. And I feel before we discuss this bit of history, this important bit of history, we should just acknowledge what's going on in Israel and the history there that has led us to this day. It's truly horrifying.
It is, Pamela. Thank you so much for inviting me. But yeah, the launch of this book comes at a very dark time in our world's history. I am not an authority on the Middle East, but I share with, I think, almost all Canadians this absolute horror at what's been visited on the people of Israel by Hamas. And whatever you think should happen next, it's almost certain that no good will come of this one way or another. But we played a part in events leading up to this in a good way. Mike Pearson chaired the UN committee that recommended a two-state solution for what was then Palestine. It's a tragedy, perhaps, that those recommendations weren't fully implemented. And John Diefenbaker was a stalwart supporter of Israel. So between them, they set in place the traditional position and the current position that Canada stands with Israel, especially at times like these.
Well, it makes the comment that if we do not understand our history and learn from it, we are failed to repeat it over and over again. And so I thank you for writing this book. I actually believe it should probably be mandatory in schools across the country, understanding who...
Please make that happen.
I don't know, but it should happen. I remember growing up as a young girl in Saskatchewan, being taken by my family with no partisan intent to see John Diefenbaker as he would visit a small town or drive down the road. And then arriving in Ottawa in the 70s as a young reporter, just as this funeral for John Diefenbaker was about to happen with the cross-country train trip, he had a flair for the dramatic, even though he was a rather shy person. Absolutely. And
there's one other thing that he had as well, which you have referenced, but that is a bond with the common people.
Yeah.
We talk a lot today about polarization and populism. John Diefenbaker was the only populist prime minister of Canada. But what do we mean by populism when we say that? We mean a boy who grew up poor, a boy whose family moved to the prairies when he was 8, who turned the sod and tried to make a living off the land, failed, as so many who tried to make that living failed. Whose last name, certainly when he was in Ontario, was subject to derision, who resented and listened to those who resented the grain merchants who wouldn't pay the price for their wheat. And he developed that career as a lawyer, as you know, in Saskatchewan, as Diefenbaker for the defense, a crusading attorney who took on the cases that nobody else would take on, never charged for those cases, and eventually came to Parliament. And he never broke faith with what in those days were called the common folk, and they never broke faith with him. You talked about that train trek back, the 10,000 who waited at Winnipeg past midnight for the train to stop, the people who just stood by the side of the roads as the train passed by, farmers pausing from the harvest in their fields. He was someone who believed in the people that he came from. and the people that he came from believed in him. Mike Pearson, we're going to talk about that, I know, did many fine things as prime minister. But that was a bond that John Diefenbaker had with the people that I don't think any other prime minister has had.
No, I mean, when you say the only populist prime minister this country has ever had, including to contemporary times, and that today is kind of a dirty word. When you talk about politics stateside or even here, and it wasn't at that point. It was who he was, and it was why he connected and why he made politics palatable to so many people.
Absolutely true. And it was also a course of time of great social and political consensus. So you could be a conservative, you could be a liberal, as John Diefenbaker and Mike Pearson were, but your worldview, the worldview of John Diefenbaker and Tommy Douglas, was not that dissimilar. The polarization that produces populism today is something different. And obviously, conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is deemed to be a populist leader, and would be the second populist prime minister. The question that I don't have an answer, but I have the question is it the same kind of populism?
Right.
Is Pierre Poilievre's populism rooted in that kind of solidarity with average, ordinary people based on his own experience with them? Or is it just trying to divide elites from regular voters and stoke resentment and ill will? If it's the latter, that is not the populism that John Diefenbaker espoused. He only ever sought to build. He never sought to tear down.
Although he and Mike Pearson went at each other tooth and nail in the House of Commons, and there was no love lost between these two men.
Absolutely not. And that's half the reason I wrote the book. One half of the reason I wrote the book was I thought that the historical treatment of Diefenbaker had been unfair. I thought over the course of a career in journalism, I just kept coming across one initiative after another initiative after another initiative that had been launched by the Diefenbaker government. And that didn't coincide with the sort of Peter Newman rebel in power notion, renegade in power notion that Diefenbaker was a failed prime minister and his government failed. It wasn't, in fact. The better way to describe the 10 years of the Diefenbaker-Pearson years was a series of initiatives in healthcare, in immigration, in foreign policy, in justice, in human rights, in constitutional reform that were all launched on John Diefenbaker's watch, and that were then pursued and sometimes completed on Mike Pearson's. That's why we say that the two of them together gave us the Canada that we inherited today. But there's the other side of it that you and I, as journalists, know. It was just a great story, right?
Yes, 10 years. Was.
No, it never happened before or since, where these two men fought election after election after election after election for power and influence, where they warred on the floor of the House of Commons. They came to quite detest each other. And I, as a writer, had just thought, you know what, this has got to be the best untold political story in Canadian history.
Well, it is.
So I decided I wanted.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, I decided I wanted to reassess Diefenbaker's prime ministership, but I also just want to tell the story of one of the funnest political fights in Canadian history.
Well, there was no television then, and of course you had to go to question period to watch the debates. I mean, even when I started in journalism, you went up to the Hill, you watched them, you sat there. I watched John Turner give a speech on capital punishment that was one of the most powerful speeches I've ever heard, but it was 10 o'clock at night and nobody ever saw it except for the scribblings of reporters the next day. And there was a lot of that. Diefenbaker was a great orator, great on his feet. Pearson not, even with a bit of a lisp and the bow ties, which there was this contrast when you saw the two of them in person.
Diefenbaker and Pearson would both have agreed with you. Pearson often said, including once to Diefenbaker himself, "I'm not a politician, I'm a diplomat." Right. He is the man who came up from Oxford into the External Affairs Department, which had just been really created, who became our nation's top diplomat, and then under Secretary of External Affairs, then the Nobel Prize winner. So he was an internationally renowned Canadian, and everyone just said, well, two things happen. Liberals always win elections, and it looks like Mike Pearson is going to be the next prime minister because that's who the Liberals seem to want to pick to be their leader. And then along came the 1957 election, and things changed quite radically. So again, in terms of politics, in terms of the debates on the House, also in terms of scandals, Canada has completely lost the art of the great scandal. The
I agree totally.
Affair, the Lucien Brevard affair, the Hal Banks affair. My gosh, those were great stories. And all stories in which Diefenbaker tormented Pearson, made his life so utterly miserable. So that was that great political theater. But while that political theater was underway, Pearson was completing Diefenbaker's implementation of universal public health care. Pearson was establishing the Canada Pension Plan after Diefenbaker had increased support for old age pensions. And in a whole range of fields, you could look at it and say, well, these are things that Pearson achieved, and that he achieved because Diefenbaker had launched those reforms.
And did the legwork. It's interesting because they are such contrasting figures, but as you alluded to, similar beginnings: son of a teacher, son of a preacher man, small town Ontario, not a lot of wealth, of course, at that time. Both served, although did not fight for various reasons. So they came through the system, but were very, very different personalities and the way they viewed the future.
Absolutely. Those are two great points. The first is, yes, the subtitle of the book is the birth of modern Canada, because their lives parallel the life of the country. As you said, they were both born in small town Ontario, the one son of a preacher, the other son of a teacher. Victoria was queen. Canada was not sovereign. It was a barely self-governing dominion within the British Empire. And their careers tracked very different careers, but they tracked the progress of the country in the First and Second World Wars, and then in the development of Canada as an important industrial and alliance power after the Second World War. And they ended fighting it out over whether Canada should employ nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. That is the track of Canada itself. And so understanding their lives is understanding the life of the country. And also another reason I wanted to write the book, which was that it's a time that people tend to forget about. You may know about Canadian history in the Second World War. You may even know about Canadian history in the First World War. You might have heard about the Fathers of Confederation. But from 1945 until Centennial was just a dark hole. But it's not a dark hole. That's when everything was actually put in place that we inherit today.
Yeah, that is our coming of age. I mean, we talk about that in terms of the military past as World War II being our finest hour on the international stage, where we, in large part, earned our reputation, not just militarily, but as a country that mattered. And you had a great turn of phrase that Canada became a nation of joiners. And because we had built this reputation, some of which I believe we've squandered today, but just spell that out a little bit, the nation of joiners.
And again, both of them can take credit. So, Pearsonian diplomacy was one in which Canada, first of all, was a member of alliances that it had helped to found. It was a founding member of NATO. It participated actively in the United Nations. Pretty much, if 2 or 3 countries got together, Canada would ask if they could come along. But we backed that up, right? We were a peacekeeping nation. We had a substantial military. We made a contribution to NATO. And John Diefenbaker signed the agreement to create NORAD that made Canada and the United States jointly responsible for Northern Hemisphere, for North American airspace. And don't forget, it was Nelson Mandela who came to the House of Commons, I think in 1980, and thanked John Diefenbaker for being the first Western leader to declare his country's opposition to apartheid, leading to the expulsion of South Africa from the Commonwealth. So again, the two men probably saw far more eye to eye on foreign policy. And yes, I think what you were alluding to, I would agree with. If they were to come back today, they would be appalled at how Canada stands diminished in the world.
Let me just read this, because your larger point about the bias in not just the media, but in the history, the writing of history in this country has always had this liberal bias in it, and the tone is there. Every book about Pierre Elliott Trudeau, except one that's out now, Mr. Plamondon, it has always has shown that bias. But this is John Diefenbaker when he put through the Canadian Bill of Rights, the forerunner to the Charter of Rights. We probably wouldn't have a charter without it. I am a Canadian, he declared in the House of Commons as he introduced the bill, a free Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship God in my own way, free to stand for what I think, free to oppose what I believe is wrong, free to choose those who shall govern my country. The heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind. It is stunningly powerful.
It is indeed. It's the reason why John Diefenbaker and Pierre Trudeau got along so well. Trudeau had Diefenbaker over to 24 Sussex for lunch. One reason was, of course, they both hated Bob Stanfield. He was the leader of the Conservative Party, and also the fellow who had ousted John Diefenbaker from the leadership, or at least Dalton Campbell.
Yep.
But the other was that Trudeau recognized that the Bill of Rights, although the Supreme Court of the day pretty much gutted it by the early 1970s, but he recognized that the Bill of Rights had placed the rights agenda on the agenda. As Justice Rosalie Abella says in the book, before that, Canadians didn't talk about what are our rights. How do we know those rights are entrenched? How can we be certain of what it is government can and cannot do to us? With the Bill of Rights, Diefenbaker established that as a vital part of any Canadian constitution. And of course, Pierre Trudeau was trying to, at that time, amend the constitution to include a Bill of Rights. So yes, there's a direct line from the Bill of Rights to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
The other thing that you said, which was quite humorous, is that the battles between Diefenbaker and Pearson that went on for so long also helped create Pierre Elliott Trudeau and the Trudeau Mania that surrounded him, because they were just kind of sick and tired of the old guys.
Yeah, I mean, remember, it was the 60s. These men were in their 60s, but getting close to 70, or in their 70s. And you had the protests against Vietnam. You had the civil rights movement in the United States. You had sex, drug, and rock and roll. As I said in an essay in the Globe last weekend, even I wore my hair long and played music that appalled my father. And we were all in this new world. Quebec was in its quiet revolution, not so quiet, really. And these old men just kept hammering away, clawing away at each other. And Centennial came along and reminded us that this is not our country. Although, don't forget, it was the Conservatives that signed the agreement to have a Centennial Exposition in Montreal in 1967. It was the Liberals under Pearson who finished the job of building Expo. Again, a joint project between the two of them. But yeah, Pierre Trudeau came along. I remember, I think you remember it. Just this amazingly charismatic and powerful figure who seemed to represent everything that was the present. And Pearson realized that. Pearson brought him into Parliament. Pearson basically campaigned for him to become leader. Diefenbaker had to be dragged kicking and screaming off the stage, but that's the way it was.
Yes, I remember the early days of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and I was in Moose Jaw, and he came to Moose Jaw and rode through town in a convertible and went to the A&W, where the car hops came out on roller skates, and everybody was just agog at this person. Like when you remember those moments again, without it was film, but certainly not television at the time. Just a little bit about and you mentioned this a moment ago, that there was so much more, despite all these battles, social consensus at the time about what mattered, about changing immigration, about building the so-called welfare state, all of those issues. The political spectrum was pretty narrow, really, when you think of it.
Yes, it was. And not just here, of course. This was true of Republicans and Democrats in the United States. It was true of Labor and Conservatives in Britain. You could have a Conservative and a Liberal Prime Minister implementing healthcare policies established by an NDP premier in Saskatchewan. And the zeitgeist was that Canada and its allies had won the war, and Canada and its allies had won the peace by creating the new suburban middle class, by giving the veterans housing, giving the veterans education and training, and that big government wanted to do more and should do more, and it was in that feeling that whether you were a farmer or a guy working the line or a professional, that you thought it was time for Ottawa to take responsibility for healthcare and for education too. Again, both presided, by flowing funding and arranging for loans programs to encourage this massive expansion in education. I don't know about you, Pamela, but I would never have made it past high school in a pre-World War II. My environment, my Latin wasn't good enough for it. But the huge expansion of the education system again, and everybody agreeing that should be done, right? You didn't have opponents of public education. You had very few opponents outside the medical profession of public health care, or of minimum levels of welfare. So there was that consensus.
Very interesting, because that we really do seem to have lost fundamentally, and I don't know, like I'm veering off in another direction, but this whole question of consensus, and as you say, the jury is out on Pierre Poilievre on either election or whether he'll represent a different kind of populism or the same kind. Where do you see this continuum? I mean, do you think there's a way back to more consensus or not? What's your gut tell you as somebody who's covered politics for a long time?
Well, first of all, our polarization is nothing like that south of the border, or even in much of Europe. So again, Canada almost envies the dysfunction of the United States and tries to copy it.
We always do that,
but maybe not so well. So that's not despair. Also, let's remember one other thing. Consensus is often produced by crisis.
Yeah,
right? There was a lot of division during the Depression, but the Second World War united Canada. I was in Washington on 9/11, and I watched the United States come together in rage, as well as grief. So sometimes maybe you don't want consensus because the consensus is achieved only as a result of trauma. Maybe polarization is something that we get to, have as a fun political game while we are otherwise quiet times. I don't think that's true, though. I do think that there are divisions emerging in the society. I think of them as class-based divisions, but others are more identity related, and again, regional divisions as well between West and Center. So there is a potential in Canada for really serious polarization to occur. That's why it is the duty of all of our politicians in all of our parties to have spirited debates, as John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson did, to fight it out on the floor, to fight it out on the hustings, but not to tear down. As I said, John Diefenbaker only sought to build up as a populist. He was the man who sat in a jail cell with a woman sobbing as she explained why she buried her dead child and didn't tell anyone the child had died. He was the one who represented the woman who said she had to kill her husband or her husband was going to kill her. He was the one who represented Métis and First Nations clients, the one who represented a man who was sent on his way to the gallows but had been assessed as having the intellect of a child. He tried to help those people and to make them and others more a part of our society. If we're going to have a populism in this country, let's have that populism and not the populism of we're just going to go after the fat cats.
But the technology has changed that forever. And then I'll get back to the book. But, when you're looking for that soundbite from Question Period or the smart comment on Twitter or X, it reduces everything to its sharpest point rather than to its more conversive point.
Yeah, and I'm not going to disagree with the word of that because every bit of it is true. There is still, though, room. There's room in my newspaper for the 5,000 word analysis piece. And there's room even on the interweb for reasoned, balanced analysis of what is happening in our society. There is, sure, there is that trend towards the soundbite, that trend towards the angry soundbite, that trend towards bias confirmation.
Yeah.
But the other stuff is out there too. And it's for people of goodwill in the political class, the journalism class, and everywhere else, to find ways to talk to each other and bridge those gaps. I would like to think that maybe one of the lessons that the Duel teaches is you live in a better country if you live in a country where people are trying to make things better through a reasonable consensus about what each and everyone believes in.
Well, and as you say, sometimes it's crisis that brings that out, provided it's not just, I mean, I saw a lot of positive things. I was in the US as well post 9/11, and yes, there was anger and retribution, but there was also a humanity that emerged. I mean, even in New York, where people are notoriously kind of, out of my way, I'm in a hurry, I'm more important than you, that all stopped for several years. So you knew it was possible.
It was, but look what had to happen before that became possible. I would rather we lived in a world where consensus emerged through shared values rather than just shared trauma.
All right. So these two men, and we started this discussion with this kind of envious tone in both of our voices about only if we could have covered all of that instead of what we ended up covering, although all interesting, right? All things are interesting, but just the nature of the debate and these two unlikely warriors. A bit more on Pearson. You said at one point that he was, of course, a bit of a jock and contributed more to the University of Toronto sports teams than to the history department. But that also made him a team guy and somebody who understood the importance of that, which did separate him from the kind of personality Diefenbaker was.
Absolutely. There are two key differences between Pearson and Diefenbaker, and both of them favor Pearson. Yeah, Diefenbaker was a loner. His sport was fishing. Pearson's sports were hockey, baseball, anything where you were part of a team. He learned moving from parish to parish, the son of a minister, how to always just jump in, make friends, get along. And by the time he reached Oxford, very powerful people were starting to notice that this young man was clearly very smart, but also very trustworthy, and very much able to make everyone in the room feel as though they were on the same page. And that, of course, was the enormous talent that took him from a pretty junior position in external affairs in the early 1930s to ambassador to the United States in 1945, and one of the architects of the United Nations relief programs, and ultimately the winner of the Nobel Prize. That gregariousness, that ability to forge consensus, was a great achievement of his. Excuse me.
Yeah, your voice there. No, that was, I found that very interesting because he was also seen as quite elitist, the bow ties, he could ingratiate himself with those in the halls of power and make them feel he was one of them, and vice versa. But yet Diefenbaker was in many respects the more successful politician, despite constantly being at war even with his own party.
He was a great politician, not just on the floor of the House of Commons, but again, on the campaign trail, on Main Streeting. But the other thing that Pearson had that Diefenbaker lacked was the ability to grow. Pearson realized after the war that the British Empire was in decline and that the new power was the United States, and that Canada had to make its relationships with that new power. He recognized as well that in this world, Canada had to be more of a sovereign nation. It had to have a sense of its own identity. It had to have its own flag. Yeah. The greatest war that was fought between Diefenbaker and Pearson was the fight over the flag. Diefenbaker wept when the maple leaf was first raised. But Diefenbaker in that case, was completely in the wrong, and Pearson was completely in the right. And now we have quite beloved national flag as a result. I would say also, as a sort of thing, that Pearson understood that Quebec was changing rapidly and its demands had to be accommodated or it would be lost. Again, that was something Diefenbaker never really understood.
Yeah, those and then do we come to a point too far, where today we're having battles about taking the imagery of World War II and our heroes out of passports and canceling ceremony. We need, yes, I agree on the flag, but Diefenbaker represented that understanding and that connection to history in the past, which was still very much alive in the hearts and souls of many people.
And maybe today, and I haven't really opined on this, but maybe today, the Pearsonian recognition that Canada needed to stop being an appendage of the British Empire and start standing on its own 2 feet has gone too far in the elimination of beloved Canadian symbols, Terry Fox, for example.
Yeah.
And the shoe is now on the Conservative foot to try to reestablish that no, John A. Macdonald was guilty of major sins, but he also was the father of Confederation, and that Canada has its own identity, but that identity is within a defined, I think, I would say, almost a celebration of the achievements of the country, of its multicultural, peaceful, accommodating nature. I've spent my entire life trying to explain everything that is wrong with Canada, but tried as well, periodically say, I say that within the context of this is the world's most successful country, and we should be, and we are blessed to live here. And by the way, to go back to the very beginning of what we talked about, never more in my life have I felt blessed to live in Canada than in the last few days, bearing in mind what the people of Israel have had to endure.
Yeah. Even at a time where we seem to be losing, the statements that were put out by the 5 of the 7 G7 nations, Canada not called, the India problem, the this, the that, we do seem to be losing our sway, our place on the stage.
I think we have, and I think it started, Pierre Trudeau, one of the first things he did as prime minister was launch a foreign policy review, in which he argued for a gradual detachment from NATO, a gradual detachment from the United States. Pearson was appalled by what Trudeau was doing in foreign policy, and also cutting funding to the military. And that was the beginning of a trend that, with ups and downs, has continued to this day. So now we are the country that says in public that we will spend 2% of our GDP in defense, and then closes the door and said, by the way, guys, not a chance. We're never going anywhere near 2% of GDP. So we're the country that says one thing and does another. That was not what Canada was. And that is why, the new alliances are quad, not quint. Yes. And that is why AUKUS, the new Australian, UK, US alliance, is not caucus, because Canada was not invited to join. I think they would both be dismayed at how much we have surrendered the capital, the credibility, the reputation that they worked so hard to establish.
When you were talking about the fascination with this, why were the scandals so much better then? Did we learn something and so we didn't repeat them? But this was wonderful. I mean, these were prostitutes.
I think there was. We were in the 60s, so in the 1940s and 50s and before, that kind of stuff probably never gotten out. There was an elite accommodation. I mean, Lester Pearson was reluctant to run for public office because he didn't think he would have enough money to retire, because there was no pay for public office. Right. So Walter Gordon, his good friend and eventually his finance minister, put together the Algoma Sports and Fishing Club, which was a group of wealthy industrialists and financiers who literally paid money into Mike Pearson's pension and whatever other financial needs Can you imagine if you or I came across the fact that there was a secret fund to pay for Mike Pearson's pension needs? So that stuff, would never come out. Yeah. The Gerda Munsinger affair was known by a number of people in the gallery, but they chose not to report it until Pearson's own minister blurted it out in the House of Commons. Yeah. I think those scandals were the early signs of a closed culture of elite accommodation beginning to open up. Yeah. But they were also, by coincidence, just wonderfully great scandals based on corruption and sex.
I mean, even in the early days when Margaret Trudeau was running around with the Rolling Stones, there was only very quiet reporting on that.
And veiled reporting, yes, absolutely. Yeah. But now, of course, within some limits, we will not hesitate to speculate on the marital troubles of politicians, and maybe if you believe that there has been a general decline in the caliber of political leadership in the country. I mean, I could debate both sides of that argument, frankly, and honestly, I debate it myself. I'm Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on one side, and Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday on the other. But if you believe there has been a general decline, it has probably something to do with the fact that the price you pay for entering politics is such a fierce exposure that it may drive people. It may drive people who would otherwise go into a public life to stay in private life instead.
I learned a couple of things in the book because you're kind of the Sandra Gwynn school of the broad sweep of history with all the details, what they had for lunch and the gossip that was being discussed. But a prominent liberal who literally saved John Diefenbaker's life. I don't know. You don't want to tell all the stories.
Well, I'll tell that one. So that was right after Diefenbaker lost the flag debate. Everybody went out. The House of Commons went on into recess. John Turner, then a rising young star in the Liberal caucus, and his wife went down to an island in the Caribbean, and Turner and Giles were walking it onto the beach, and there was a man in the water who was clearly struggling. Turner was an almost Olympic athlete, leapt into the water, swam out, rescued the man, and it was John Diefenbaker, who had gotten himself into trouble and then had gone to the same island as well. So, yes, a future Liberal Prime Minister saved a previous Conservative Prime Minister from drowning. It's a small political world.
These are such wonderful stories. The other thing, which is historically very important, and you talked about the sort of the liberal bias in history telling, was the story of the Avro Arrow.
And that, I think, is one of the key elements of the narrative. Everybody knows the Avro Arrow story. It was a beautiful airplane. It was state-of-the-art, and it was state-of-the-art. The first onboard computers, twice the speed of sound. No other fighter had matched it. And then John Diefenbaker, in a temperamental fit of pique, canceled the entire program and smashed what materials were left, and it was a catastrophe. It destroyed the aviation industry in this country, and we mourn the loss of the Arrow to this day. Yep. Nothing maybe has tarnished his reputation more. The problem with that analysis is he was right to cancel the Arrow. How right was he to cancel the Arrow? Well, the Saint Laurent government, in one of its last cabinet meetings, just before the 1957 election, resolved to cancel the Arrow. But they weren't going to announce it until after the election, which they assumed they won because Liberals would always won elections.
Yeah, they always won.
So it was Diefenbaker who inherited a decision that the Liberal government had made. And it was the right decision. Why was it the right decision? Because literally on the day the Arrow was rolled out, Sputnik launched from the Soviet Union. And the day that Sputnik launched, the Avro Arrow became obsolete. The Arrow was designed to intercept and bring down bombers flying over the Arctic, delivering nuclear weapons to North America. But Sputnik meant that any real future exchange was going to be ICBM-based and not bomber-based, and therefore there was no need for such a high-tech, state-of-the-art interceptor fighter. And furthermore, the United States, Britain, and France had no intention of buying it from us. They had major military aviation industries of their own. They would build their own fighters. Thank you very much. So with no actual need and with no markets and with massive expense, there was no decision there was no right decision other than to cancel the Arrow. And anyone who has done a credible analysis of the situation has reached the same conclusion.
But he paid the price. Honestly, those are just a couple of little things in this book that it's so fascinating, so well researched. And it is called The Duel. And it was dueling personalities, but dueling views of the world as well. Diefenbaker, Pearson and the Making of Modern Canada. And the author is John Ibbitson, one of this country's best journalists and writers, author of many books. And it's just a pleasure. We're going to let you stop talking now because I know you've been struggling. I just didn't want to let you go. I was being completely selfish. So thank you so much.
It was so much my pleasure. Thank you, Pamela.
Well, it's great. Good luck with everything, and we'll see you soon in the nation's capital.
All right, take care.
John Ibbitson with us today on No Nonsense. And that is it for this edition. We'll see you very soon.